All right, so what we are looking at is a terracotta group that that is commonly referred to as Orpheus and the Sirens, and obviously this bald figure here, the central image in the terracotta, the Greek terracotta that is currently in the possession of the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, and was purchased in, I believe the article said 1976, but apparently the purchase is somewhat questionable in terms of whether this group of artifacts was stolen, and the stealing and the theft and the history of colonialism that belongs to this particular grouping. You know, both the material sculptural artifact itself and to the story that it depicts is so complicated that I want to discuss it, and I want to propose a kind of performance project that I may never realize. In fact, I'm not sure that I'm entirely the best individual suited to realize this project, and I'm really hoping someone, maybe Clorinda McGlow will somehow happen upon this project proposal and take it up. Clorinda did this marvelous performance and theatricalization of the story of Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, and the final version of this project, which involved song and dance and performance and choreography, was staged on board ship in some dock of some harbor in New York City, and I don't entirely recall exactly where, but having seen the preliminary versions of that piece, and leading up to its final realization, and the setting in which it was completed, it was a really marvelous performance. But I'm hoping someone will do something similar with this project proposal that is, as I had mentioned, so much a narrative of multi-layered coloniality that it's very interesting. And you see from these figures that there's already the suggestion of a potential stage setting here, which you can easily translate these figures into a theatrical space. You can imagine, Orpheus, whoever plays that part, sitting here and narrating this tale, or singing this tale, or performing this tale in various ways. And you can imagine that these two figures, represent sirens as they would appear on stage. And I love the way that everyone has a platform. There are these multiple layers of platforms. You can't see Orpheus's feet and the platform that he's sitting on in this image. Maybe the LA Times oh yeah, okay. So this is the image from the Los Angeles Times, and you can see what I like about these platforms and this representation and the way that these figures are in some sense hanging in space is that in terms of the representation of the continuity of space-time in theatrical representation, these platforms really allow this kind of suspension in the flux and flow of these durations of the real, right? And that's so important in the telling of all these multiple layers of this story. So, even before, getting into whether this piece, should be returned to the Italians or to Rome, or whether it's, because it's a Greek sculpture, a Greek terracotta group that was created in the 4th century BC by, colonizers who were originally from Sparta that had colonized this area and there were a lot of Greek colonies in Italy. The area from which this piece emerges, itself has an interesting story, and is now called Taranto, and presumably has been called Taranto since it was, recolonially displaced or recolonized by Rome. And there were, of course, similar recolonializations of these Greek colonies, not all of which were Spartan or Dorian, but by the Romans as they began to build their empire out of what was originally Etruscan culture, right? And the original name, for this Greek colony, and the name by which it would have been referred to when this particular terracotta sculpture group was created in the 4th century BC was Taras, and that name refers to the eponymous founder of the colony, at least according to the myth that the Greeks constructed to justify their ownership and belonging and possession of this particular place, and in that myth, a hero, Taras, who and there are two variations of Taras's story, but the variations really relate to his parentage, and in both stories of Taras' parenthood, he's the son of Poseidon, the sea god, and that makes his travel, by sea, and this colonial journey that he undertakes, understandable in light of his relationship to the Moira, right, the Fates, right, and the colonial justification also is situated within his maternal lineage, but in different ways, as the story is told in these two different variations. So I'll tell both of those variations of the origins of Taras' mother, Soteria. But before I do that, I want to remind everyone that that this figure that we're looking at in this image, and that I have a close-up on here, situated between the two representations of these figures who may represent sirens. That's the interpretation that we've given to this terracotta piece, and I don't particularly find any reason to refute that, but there are other possible interpretations. But this figure who is, said to represent Orpheus, and again, all of these interpretations are likely, and I can talk later about why they're likely, but there are, open to open to discussion and argumentation, and certainly shouldn't be taken as the final word on what these figures might represent. But within that framework of understanding and interpreting these figures, I don't want anyone to get lost, or not perhaps too lost, and confuse this particular face and representation of this particular figure with the figure of Taras, whose story I'm now narrating. And I want to remind everyone that this is, in this interpretation, the figure of Orpheus, the poet, the singer. And in the telling, that I'm providing here, in a certain metapoetic sense, this figure represents the teller of the tale that I'm narrating now. So Orpheus is me representing these stories and telling these stories. And in that sense, he's being constructed meta-narratively and meta-poetically by the discourse that I'm providing here as a teller of stories, more like a Herodotus, right? The original historian who traveled to various locations and collected these stories from the people. In a sense, he was a conceptual artist. He retold other people's stories. He didn't invent stories of his own, although there was occasionally an element, as is the case in, and Italo Calvino makes much of it, in Invisible Cities, the narrating of the adventure of discovering these places as well. And in fact, you could say in Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino, that meta narrative telling of the tale becomes the how would you put it? What Roman Jakobson refers to as the dominant in that particular poetics of that Calvino invents, for the purpose of narrating these tales of the travels of Marco Polo and these, of course, fictionalized conversations that he has with the fictionalized figure of Kublai Khan and the fictionalized descriptions that he provides, for these various cities, but in which, right, he narrates various accounts of the way that these descriptions, either proceed from his experience of these places, or from stories told about these places, or from comparisons and contrasts between those two, sets of information. And here, I suppose, I'm providing, a similar kind of, narrative account rather than performing in this mode of, what we usually assign to the lyric, right? Or the, we could say, aesthetic pleasures produced in song. And so that distinction, should be made. And I would want, that distinction to play itself out if this project, this performance project, were ever to be realized. And so there would be perhaps, moments in which this figure narrating these stories, this Orphic figure, would either discuss or enact, right, these two different understandings of poetry as song that possesses a sort of mysterious and mystical power, the power of enchantment. And enchantment, relates to, before we return to Taras's story and his origins and their justification for the colonialism that myth, narrates. There's an interesting relationship between enchantment and Orpheus and these sirens. Well, the sirens are obvious enchanters, and so the names provided for the sirens are in themselves interesting and in themselves related in multiple ways to stories of Orpheus and his ability to charm stones, to enter the realm of the dead, to charm Hades and Persephone in a certain way, and to enchant inanimate objects and animals with the power of his song and his voice. And there's reason to believe that there are, in fact, 3 sirens rather than 2, as they're depicted in the terracotta piece that's represented in these images that we're interrogating right now, which currently belong to the Getty Museum, and which arrangements are being made, to return to Italy, but presumably Rome, not to Taranto or Taras. And I will return to the story of Taras, hopefully, momentarily. But I want to complete, this digression before I enter into another digression within the digression. But these names, the names are described in Hesiod in catalogs of women as Aglaphonus, which means splendid sounding, Molpe, which means song, and Thalxinoi, or Thalxipoi, which means either charming the mind or charming voice, the ability to charm the mind or possessing a charming voice. And in the Bibliotheca, the Pseudo-Apollodorus describes these same 3 sirens as Aglaopia, Paisinoi, and Thalxipia, and so there's a lot of crossover there. So both agree that one of the sirens is named for this Greek root thelx, and that means to charm or charming. And both of the writers also agree that one of the sirens is named after the root aglau, and disagree whether that's aglophonus or aglopi, and the difference there would be aglophonus is the root is splendid, and the difference would be that's either splendid sounding or splendid voice, which are in fact very similar. And then where they seem to disagree is that Hesiod refers to a molpi, song, right? And the Pseudo-Apollodorus refers to the name Pisinoi, and that latter word means affecting the mind. Well, perhaps the pseudo-Apollodorus, felt the need to underscore the fact that to charm is to enchant, is to affect the mind, and reiterated, in a sense, that idea in the names of two of the sirens, both in Pisinoi and in Thalxippia, and isolated, this idea of splendid or the beautiful in the third siren's name. Now, in the representation of the terracotta, you'll note that that there are, in fact, not three sirens, represented as the narrative, provides, the myth provides, or the accounts of these myths provide, as related by Hesiod and as related by the pseudo-Apollodorus. But the rationale, can be seen for that in the choice of the sculptor, the artisan creating the piece. Clearly, chose the aesthetic solution and the representation of the two sirens surrounding the frame of and framing, in a certain sense, Orpheus, and representing in a symbolic kind of way, his passage through the sea, and they would have been situated on one side, right? If one imagines that this representation of Orpheus on this particular kind of platform and these sirens on this other platform represent a scene from a narrative in which the Argonauts on their journey are being tempted by the calls of these sirens, and of course. The leader of that journey is Jason, and but Orpheus is a member of the crew, and the way that they survive is that Orpheus plays his harp and perhaps sings and perhaps not, but plays his harp and presumably sings, and his music overwhelms, right, or overtakes. Is more powerful than the charm of these sirens' songs and voices, and therefore, he's able to save, I think, all of the members of his crew but one from the enchantments that lead so many sailors to their destruction, following the charm of these voices into the rocks and dangerous shoreline, from which these sirens lure them, and so the choice to represent these two sirens rather than three, shouldn't be, I don't think should be regarded as a dispute, a dispute in the narrative, and a representation of a kind of a discourse, dismissing the conventionalization of these three figures, and of course the three women, the three sirens. The representation of the number three, relate them again, to the idea of fate, via the Moire, and the three, who you will recall, represent the destiny of one's life, through the metaphorical vehicle of yarn or thread, and the spinning of that thread, the measurement of that thread, and the cutting of that thread, so that it takes these three symbolic representations of within that composite metaphor, right, to represent one's destiny, and so the sirens that lead one to one's destruction and doom, they are also represented in this three-part figuration, right, and which totally makes sense. And the choice made by the sculptor, whoever that sculptor might have been in the 4th century BC, in Taras, or what has become to be known as Taranto, via the recolonization around I believe the year was 122, or that's probably not precise, but around 122 BC by the Romans. That choice, made by that artisan, to my reading, doesn't represent a refutation of the number of sirens in a narratively discursive manner, but represents an aesthetic choice. And in a sense, it's choosing, right, between these two options of understanding poetry, either as narrative or as enchanting song. And the reason that it is because it's presumably a decision made based on the idea that it's more aesthetically pleasing for this representation to present a kind of a symmetry, a pattern of symmetry in which the solitary figure of Orpheus is framed by two female figures, both on the left and the right. So there's a kind of bilateral symmetry, or mirror symmetry, depending on which way you're looking at it. But in both cases, there's a mirroring, right? And the mirror, right, is in the center of the representation, and the symmetry proceeds from the position, and one could say positionality of Orpheus, himself, and that choice, that aesthetic choice over narrative or historical accuracy, belongs, to that relationship that Orpheus shares with the sirens. That is to the beautiful, and I'll weed that out a little bit in the morphological significance of these various names that the sirens are assigned, but hopefully, if this project were ever realized, this consideration or this concern with these names and what they represent would be worked out both on the aesthetic level and in terms of the narrative being told as well, and not necessarily in sync, right? There could be disparities, and before I go into those names, I'll return to this idea of this division and suggest ways in which it's certainly neither exclusive, but whose components can be put together in a number of different ways, right? So I had been talking about ballad form in the last couple of pieces that I've done, the last couple of discourses that I've produced, and particularly in relationship to Emily Dickinson. But presumably, in ballad form, there are a number of elements that we recognize, and one of those elements is metrical, right, and can be described in terms of metrical patterns, and that belongs to this idea of song. And under the conditions that we're talking about here, that represents this element of the charming, the ability to move the mind, right, to affect or and in some ways enchant, right, this enchanting quality, and also to the category of the beautiful. And so presumably, one could imagine that it's possible, like that there's a form that is merely metrical and doesn't have content. Whether that content is articulated at the abstract level of narrative versus non-narrative, or whether that content is more thematically specified, as I was suggesting, in the ballad form and its relationship to the transfiguration of the criminal outlaw into the hero, right, via the narrative and through this song form. Now, if one could imagine that there were ballads that were somehow non-narrative, then one could also imagine that there could be ballads that are non-linguistic. That is, if one were to extract the metrical form and produce just the mere sound of the voice and the beauty of the articulation of non-semantically and non-semiotically meaningful vocalizations, one could imagine a kind of production of Lisa Gerard-like idiolect that these sirens might be engaging in, and one could also imagine that these sirens are not entirely incapable of telling stories or whispering semantically meaningful vocables in the ears of sailors, and that there may be either fragments of narratives or fragments of suggestions or fragments of meaningful discourse in the songs that they sing as well. So those are interesting questions and give rise to interesting ways of working with of this particular narrative. Now, the names themselves that are provided in various mythological accounts of the sirens vary, but they have three key central and pivotal, I believe, sets of related concerns. And so I'll give a brief inventory of some of those names and the ways in which these three sirens, that are related to this concept of the three fates, seem to embody, three principles, or three sets of concepts that form a kind of synergistic, self-defining autonomy, for this particular set of mythological representations that we refer to as the sirens. So I'll list some of those names and what they mean in Greek, and then I'll discuss what I think these three elements are that define the idea of the siren song. All right, so the first one of the names, and we've discussed a lot of these, is Thalciope, and that's charming voice. Thalcinoe, and that's the charming mind. Thalcipia is charming itself. That's the word for charming. And all three of those names are provided in various narratives concerning the sirens. But again, I'm arguing that there are in fact three, and that these names relate to one or more in variously complex ways, but are renominalizations of one or more of these three sirens. Molpi is another song. Pisinoe, affecting the mind. Algophonos, splendid sounding. Ligia, clear toned. Leucosia, which is an interesting one because it means white stuff, but leucosia seems to suggest a relationship with the word from which Aphrodite, right, the goddess of beauty, is derived, and that word is aphros, which means foam. She's the goddess who's given birth from the foam of the waves, and her birth is interesting in that respect, and unique, to the other god births. But that relationship between the waves and the foam and beauty, is hinted at, I believe, in the word leucosia, which doesn't specify that it is the aphros, that is the leuc, that is white, right? But it hints at it, because where do these sirens call from? Well, they call from the sea, they call from the shore, they call from the tide, they call from the foam. And so what is the white stuff other than the aphros, right? Well, one could make that point or argue that point, but I think there's reason to believe that this name, right, is linked to the concept of Aphrodite, and therefore to the concept of beauty. All right, so aglope, splendid voice, and parthenope, maiden voice. All right, so the three concepts that I want to elicit from all of this cluster of names, and these sort of morphological sets, and variations of these sets that move around, with some exception, like leucosia and Ligia, white stuff and clear toned, and also Pisione, affecting the mind, but largely, like, they represent three different ideas, and one of the ideas is charm, and charm specifically here means to enchant. And that is very similar to this other characteristic, which is affecting the mind, right? So they enchant, they move the mind, they change the mind, they draw the possessor of that mind into condition of danger and potential self-destruction through this ability of enchantment and charm, right? And then the other is the beauty, and that's represented in leucosia, the white stuff, particularly if one associates it with the foam of the waves, and aphros and Aphrodite. And in these morphological representations of the word agla, right? Aglau, splendid voice, splendid sounding. And even the word song, it hints at, because what is a song if not something beautiful? One doesn't generally associate song in the sense of human voice with something disturbing. We give those representations different names, like noise and dissonance and discord, right? Well, discord could mean a number of things, but let's not get into that here. But that's precisely the third one. So there's enchantment, and there's beauty, and then the third element that's represented is the idea of the voice, particularly the human voice, right? And so that's in Parthenope, that's in Aglope, that's in Thalciope, and it's also in Molpe, right? The idea of song, right? So a number of these names that are provided for the sirens have that specification, that it is the voice. It is not just music that can be played on an instrument, but it's the human voice. And because many of the sirens are also named, well, I suppose there's really only one that's obviously named as a figuration of the feminine, Parthen, right? Parthenope. but there is one. The suggestion is that this beauty belongs particularly to the female human voice, or the feminine human voice, or the representation of this principle of femininity, right? That the sirens also embody, and so that figuration of three is in some way essential to the story, to charm, to be beautiful, and for those two characteristics to belong to the material and physical quality of the human voice, particularly the human female voice.
Okay, so just one more element in this rather long digression relating the figure of Orpheus to the characterization of these sirens before we return to the two variations of the maternal heritage of Taras, and how that those two variations of maternal heritage, play out justifications for this colony of Taras, now and then, if then is sometime after 122 BC, referred to as Taranto, not Toronto, not that not the Taranto in Quebec, but this Taranto in northeastern Italy, and this final consideration relates not to the construction, right, of these aesthetic synchronies of voice and of enchantment and of beauty that in some way link the figure of Orpheus to the sirens, but relate rather to another mythos, another story that involves these sirens and the themes in various stories that we know concerning Orpheus. All right, and so there's a story or one version of a myth, and this is the myth of Hades' abduction of Persephone. And you'll recall that Persephone is the daughter of Demeter, the goddess of the seasons, the earth goddess, the goddess of the harvest, and of the bearing of vegetal life, right? And that when Demeter, in one of the tellings of the story, when Demeter realizes that her daughter is missing, she transforms the sirens into these winged beings who are able to traverse the earth and other domains. They become what I refer to as existential border crossers, and they're able to discern that she has in fact been abducted to the underworld, and in this transfigured or transformed morph, right, or morphology that they take on via the intervention of Demeter. And as discoverers of Persephone, and as existential border crossers, capable of entering the domain of the dead, they relate to a number of figures, to Persephone herself, but also to other representations. In if you wanted to do a cross-cultural comparative reading, you could relate these crossings to experiences in other mythologies, such as Babylonian mythology, in which Inanna and also in her incarnation as Ishtar is existential border crosser who enters the domain of the dead to converse with her sister. And Hecate also in Greek culture could be seen to prefigure, right, Orpheus as one of these, archetypal, representations of female divinity that transgress in some ways the separation of this distinction between the realm of the living and the realm of the dead, and are able to traverse, right, this domain, cross this threshold, or this this veil that separates these worlds. And as such, Orpheus in his recovery of Eurydice, also challenges the authority of Hades and Persephone, to hold her captive among the dead, and is successful in convincing them, under terms of one of these, tricky contracts, that he can recover her and return her to the realm of the living, which he almost does, but he fails to uphold the conditions of that contract, which is that he doesn't look back at her, and before they have left the realm of the dead. And that's played out in Jean Cocteau, of course, in his representation of the Orpheus story, in which Orpheus recovers Eurydice from the realm of the dead, but can never look at her. And the play there, of course, in this contract relates to beauty once again, and the ironies and paradoxes of this charm that Orpheus possesses, that belongs, right, as we've discussed, to this domain of beauty, and presumably both Orpheus and Eurydice are representations and embodiments of this concept of beauty, but he can never experience the pleasures of that beauty because he cannot perceive her, and he's bound to fail, right, in his heroic attempt, because, right, I guess, of the manipulated characteristics of his powers and abilities, manipulated by the contract, right? That Hades is well aware that Orpheus can't fulfill, because the very source of his power already is already subject to the destructive, right? The destructive conditions of the contract, which in a certain sense, has to be breached, because the pleasures of beauty are so inherent in the powers of enchantment that belong, to Orpheus to begin with. All right, well, that's a bit complicated, but one can clearly see the way that that narrative, also relates Orpheus to the figuration of these sirens, and that'll be it before we return to the story of Taras and his maternal heritage. Other than to note the fact that in a certain way, this is also a feminizing of Orpheus, right? His story is, in a sense, feminized from the outset, or one could say that it's the retelling of this feminine story, right, or the story that belongs to the depiction of women in these cross-cultural representations as existential border crossers who can enter the domain of that separates the living from the dead, and that includes Hecate, and that includes Inanna, and that includes Ishtar, and others, it's the sort of, you could say, the repatriizing, right, of a myth that belongs to this notion of it's really. One could say, in Jungian terms, a psychological formation of the representation of the idea of sexuality and death, and hence belongs, both to allusions to virginity in a certain sense, then that would be the Persephone element, and into the notion of motherhood, separation. So one could think of it either way, as a feminization of this particular hero. If one imagines that that he has a story that is in some way the precursor or preface to that part of his story that belongs to entrance into the underworld, or one could imagine it as the repatriarchalizing of this story, if one imagines that the core of his narrative already always begins with his descent into the underworld. All right, so then at this point, let us return to variations in the myth of the heritage of Taras's mother. And once again, I'll have you recall that the figure that we're looking at here, framed by the two sirens, at least in one reading of this terracotta grouping, is not Taras, who is the founder, right, or the eponymous founder of the place where this terracotta image originates from, but is in fact Orpheus, or perhaps is myself, or as Orpheus narrating this long and cumbersome colonialist story. All right, and mythos, and in a certain sense, almost mythology, because as in any good mythology, all of the various myths, all of the various stories, aren't isolated as they are in Herodotus, but form a cosmology and a complex of interacting stories in which no element can ever said to have reached a dead end, but will find its way back into the fabric of the fictional construct, which in a very sophisticated way, right, imitates the manner in which our reality, nothing in our reality is really simply a remainder, but that everything within it has an existence and an evolution and a process of changes, which correspond to the duration of whatever it is that our universe is confined within, or possesses the capacity of expanding toward, right? All right, so returning, and here I am, returning to the story of Taras's heritage and its variations. His mother's name is Satyria, and in one version of the myth, she encounters Poseidon, and in fact, in both in both variations of the myth, she encounters Poseidon. It is a sexual encounter, and the consequences of the encounter are that she gives birth to this child, Taras. In one variation, she is from the location Taras, where the eponymous founder, Taras, relocates and colonizes, right, and begets this city. But in fact, in this version, because she's a Tarentian nymph, a sea goddess that belongs to this place, Taras has a kind of claim to the possession of this location and this place as property, right, via his maternal lineage. So if via his paternal lineage, which is divinity of the highest order, being the son of the sea god, he has an inheritance that belongs to, you could say all of those shores and earthen properties that that fall under the domain of his father, right? So the coastline of Italy and this particular location in Italy, which has a particularly substantial amount of coastal property, right? Belongs to Taras, both by divine right and inheritance through his father Poseidon as coastal shoreline, and as birthplace of his mother, the sea goddess Satyria. And that's one variation. And in a way, it's not as perhaps not as significant to this depiction and the representation of the story that this depiction presents to us, and Orpheus's encounter with these three sirens who are here represented by these two figures, right? But the other variation is perhaps more significant to this representation, and in that story, Satyria is the daughter of Minos, and Minos is the king of Crete, and specifically in the mythology and the story of Minos, is the ruler of Crete at a time in which every 9 years a sacrifice was made of 7 daughters and 7 sons of Minos' realm to the mythological creature of the Minotaur, and that Minotaur was kept in a kind of prison that was called the labyrinth, and this labyrinth was designed by the inventor Daedalus to hold this creature, who was the offspring of Minos' wife Pasiphae, and the creature of a bull, and this horror was kept by Minos, who utilized it, right, as the vehicle through which this violent sacrifice could be performed. And in this version, Satyria, as one of the daughters of Minos, does not belong to the place of Taranto or Taras, as it would be named after her son, but rather belongs to this place of sacrifice and of human destruction. And as such, one could see, both her experience and the experience of her migrating child as results of a kind of human displacement, right? A kind of forced displacement. And the displacement that describes the experience of Taras really belongs to this this idea of a tyrannical government, right? Or a tyrannical social order that, in order to ensure his survival, he flees from. So the justification in this particular variation of the myth is quite different. It doesn't belong to some notion of property as inheritance, or property as divine right, or property as a birthright of belonging to a natal place, right? Like in the United States, we have policies. If you're born here, you're a citizen, no matter what the circumstances, right, of your migration or immigration to the United States are on your parents' part. That there's a natal right, that you have if you belong to this place. And in the first variation of the story, something like that is being played out, right? That even though Taras is responsible for this colony and this city, and it takes his name, that he had a right to belong there for these reasons. And in the second version of the story, something quite extraordinary happens, right? That we see him as an example of this forced displacement, and the justification is, one could say, rather ethical and moral, rather than legal or genetic, right? Or belonging to a topoi or topos. It's not a matter of dominion, but a matter of a human right to exist, with under conditions of relative liberty, as opposed to tyranny and the threat of annihilation. And it's interesting to me that that story, also relates, back to the construction of the labyrinth and all of the entailments, that a labyrinth brings to this tale, right? And not just in terms of the story of the labyrinth, but also the labyrinth as a form and a way of telling, in which the story itself becomes a manner of finding one's way, through a complex and difficult, series of passages that in order to traverse, one has to spend a lot of time learning. It's the root, right, of labyrinth as story, or labyrinth as narrative, is always already, hidden and has to be discovered, and has to be learned, and has to be practiced before the root, of its truth, can be traversed. Unless, of course, one has a method, like the ball of yarn, that Theseus uses on the advice of Ariadne, who informs him that if he retraces the root of provided by the string, that once he slays the creature of the Minotaur, that he can find his way back. Fortunately, in that particular telling, the Minotaur isn't intelligent enough to discover the string and either re-loop it in a way that misrepresents the course of Theseus's journey into the labyrinth, or to cut it and confound Theseus that way. But unless one has a trick or a method or a means of turning the labyrinth into a linearity, which is precisely what the ball of yarn does, right? It turns this complex, twisting, non-linear structure into the narrative of Theseus's course through the labyrinth. And we've used that strategy before, for example, in the act of physically writing on the page. And in describing the difficulties of my dysgraphia, I often represent the act of writing by hand. And no matter how difficult it is to follow the course of the writing as it is represented in the architecture of the final result, that is the page, I have used the strategy of filming or video recording the act of writing in linear time and letter by letter as a means of allowing the viewer to follow the course of the formation of each word, and even if those words are scattered throughout the page in a non-linear manner, and one can't follow them anymore line by line, one can still follow them in the linearity composed in the time of the writing. And that, in a sense, is like the ball of yarn or the ball of string, a way of transforming an architectonics of complexities and dead ends and loops, right, and repetitions into a linearity that one can process perhaps more easily and make sense of, right? So in both instances, there are strategies that reduce the complexities of a labyrinth-like architecture or architectonics. And of course, that is precisely what I, as this Orphic figure narrating this particular mythology or series of stories and interconnected histories, am not doing in the course of allowing all of these various digressions and allowing allowing that part of the logos, of the mythos, that is all of the interconnected elements of the totality of its world, right, as cosmos, to enter into the playing out of the story. In other words, all of the branches and all of the alcoves of the labyrinth, allowing the narrative to describe them, to discuss them, to peer into them, and then to return, without the use of a ball of yarn, to two issues in the story, that concern us more relevantly, perhaps, to this narrative of this profoundly, mythological narrative of colonialism. All right, so by virtue of the fact that he doesn't really have a safe place and home in his grandfather's homeland, and is a potential, victim of these sacrifices that are made, by his grandfather to the creature of the labyrinth. He becomes a displaced person, and his freedom, right, is a representation, of the shelter seeker, and in that way, right, he's much more like a Liberian than he is like a boyar, right? If his destination were some location in Africa, in the continent of Africa, and those differences seem to me to be profound, and the justification of his place, right, and his status in Taras, in those two variations, seems to me to be profound. And even in the variations, we see that there's a kind of discourse on colonialism and displacement that belongs to these two possibilities, right? And all of the ethics and materiality that belong to the presumptions behind, right, the justifications for such a departure and such a new beginning, right, are perhaps being played out in the representation that we're looking at of this subject, who, as I am utilizing him, is narrating this tale, but who, as depicted in this piece, is singing, right, a song of charm and beauty, and enchantment, and functionally a kind of protective service he is offering, to the members of his crew, right? So let's talk about some of the ways in which this particular story and this particular moment in the story of the journey of the Argonauts relates to those options that we have in understanding the colonial history of Taras. And we can begin with understanding why this journey is made and who it's made by, to begin with. So the captain of this journey that Orpheus, finds himself a part of is, of course, Jason. And the reason for the journey is to venture to the land of Colchis, which is described, in this myth and by the parameters of Greek understanding of this place as a land of barbarians. And the purpose of the journey and of Jason's undertaking it is to retrieve this magical artifact that belongs to the ruler of this place called cheese. And it is the fleece of a golden sheep. So it's referred to as the golden fleece. And it has certain magical protective properties that ensure the safety of the domain under which it presides, right? So a kind of shield, right? And Jason's uncle instructs him to undertake this journey and to steal this object. So it's a colonial project, right? He goes to this land and he steals, right, one of their possessions from them and takes it back to his homeland, right, his natal home, and his uncle promises him, a place, and the rights to his property, the birthright to his place within his homeland if he performs this function. Of course, later, he reneges on this, and then there's all kinds of trouble. But that's the promise. And in some ways, the myth already presupposes that there'll be a breach of contract. But the contract is made, in in terms that involve a kind of piracy, to begin with, right? So it's not, strictly speaking, a legal operation that's engaged by Jason and the members of the crew. But if there is any justification, the justification is the same justification that's often made in colonialist projects, is that these individuals come from a place of civilization and law and order, and are merely stealing from barbarians, right? And in Greeks, in the Greek culture, there are two words for stranger, and they're very different. So one word for stranger is xenos, right? And you could also say there's two words for foreigner, right? And one of these is xenos, and xenos represents one is not from the place, right? But one is a Greek, and so to xenos belongs this idea of mutuality and what's perceived as like ideological equality under the terms in which citizenship, can be imagined. One can be a Greek from another city, whether one is from Thebes or Athens or Sparta. One is still a Greek, although one may not be a citizen of that particular place, right? And that's contrasted with this other Greek word for stranger, which is barbaros, and that's a condition under which one finds oneself as non-Greek, and therefore there is a distinction in status, in Greek cultural thought and ideology between an individual in that realm and another, and in some ways, this is what justifies this particular colonial project and justifies the theft to begin with. And when Jason and the Argonauts, arrive in Colchis and they are, they encounter these obstacles in the theft of the Golden Fleece, it becomes obvious that the assistance of Medea, who belongs to the royal family, will be very useful. And of course, Medea, herself is a sorceress or an enchantress, and she falls under the enchantment of the beauty of Jason. And I hope I've been using his name Jason and didn't inadvertently refer to the captain of this vessel as by another name. But Jason mesmerizes her in a certain way and charms her, and she falls under, her mind, right, is affected by the charms of his what, not song but beauty, right? So beauty is the enchanter in this case, once again, the enchantment of beauty. So this story already has a lot of the elements that are represented in this particular scene, right, from within this larger myth, and you could say there are sets and subsets of similar themes and that get played out in various ways. And so, though Medea is an enchantress, she's enchanted by, perhaps Eros, and his arrows of desire that inspire her to betray her family, for her love of Captain, Jason, who is basically a pirate, there to steal her family's heirloom, and Aegis, this golden fleece. So she does that, and in the course of recovering this artifact, this object, right, which is very much like has to do with these cultural artifacts that are stolen, from various locations, usually, China or Africa or some other, colonialized continent or domain, right, via the same arguments and ideological, rhetoric, under which, through which Jason performs, his theft of the golden fleece. So, all right. So then, if one has read either Claude Lévi-Strauss's discourse on the exchange of women and the exchange of women's relationship to patriarchy and to organizations of clan systems and rights of ownership in cross-culturally that belong to cultures that in one way or another, whether they're matrilineal or patrilineal, belong to organizations of gender differences and oppression that belong to what we generally refer to as patriarchy, or or if one has read, Gail Rubin's The Traffic in Women, that evolves, from that discussion in Lévi-Strauss and Moss, but that in some ways, exceeds both of those discourses and attempts to locate, gender oppression and constructs, of gender and sexuality and the rights, over one's body, and the right to conceive, of one's body as either belonging to oneself or to another, that would be, a man. That these institutions of oppression, in fact, grow out of the economics of the exchange, or what she refers to as the traffic in women. So in a way, what Rubin does is she creates an etiology of gender oppression utilizing this sociological construct. But in any case, whether one has read one or both or the other of those discourses, one immediately recognizes that when Jason takes Medea, the sorceress, back with him to his homeland in Greece, that he, under the conditions of this particular social, cultural, political ideology of patriarchy, has committed yet another act of theft, and is not only stealing an artifact, but is stealing his bride to be, and because he was not authorized to do so, and as a woman, even though she has a high place in this particular society and belongs to the royal family, Medea does not have the right to give herself to this colonialist, and so her betrayal of her family is also a violation of the institutional values, to which she belongs. Even though she's presented, in the myth as a barbarian, but nevertheless, these cultural values exceed that distinction, right, between Hellen or Greek and barbaros. So Jason, in this act of retrieving this artifact from this place, this artifact that doesn't belong to him, this piracy, right? Also, under the conditions of the authority of this patriarchal institution, has committed, another crime, against the people, the social fabric, right, of Colchis. Another act of piracy in taking, essentially, his lover and his a woman who's to become the mother of his children, and of course, that's another part of this mythology that we probably don't have time to engage here, but that might become interesting in this story, the story of this artifact as well. All right, so all of that is going on in the recovery of the theft of the Golden Fleece, and that narrative, which I mentioned, this image, right, is a fragment of that image, a moment in that narrative, that longer narrative of that belongs to this story of theft and piracy, and this particular moment in that larger narrative represents an encounter that the Argonauts had with these sirens, and it represents the manner through which Orpheus protected the crew from the enchanting and beautiful voices of these sirens who were attempting to lure the pirates to their destruction. Okay, so before I proceed any further into the tale of this specific moment in the narration of this journey to steal the Golden Fleece, and this moment is the encounter that the Argonauts have with the sirens and how they're protected by Orpheus. I want to go further back into the mythology and say something about what Apollonius, at least, makes of the relationship, the heritage of Orpheus and the sirens, and in fact, Orpheus and the sirens are cousins, and they're cousins on their maternal on the maternal side of their heritage, and that side is the side from which they are descended from Muses, and the sirens are descended from the muse Terpsichore. And Terpsichore is the muse of dance. And that may seem strange in relationship to their enchanting power, which is the power of song and the beauty of the voice. But if one thinks about this particular understanding of the enchantment of the voice as it relates to the way that it's used, it's telos as this lure. Perhaps this particular gift of song is in some ways a form of dance, and the allure and pleasure of this kind of dance, or this exhibitionism, right, of a kind of beauty, especially an idealized feminine beauty that inspires, right? Not only just a metaphorical movement of the mind and change of the mind, but an actual movement, toward the dangers of these jagged rocks and this coastline that these sirens lure, both legitimate sailors and pirates toward. And Orpheus is descended from, his mother is the muse Calliope, who is the muse of epic poetry. Now, this is again interesting because although he is mythologized and stories are told of his ability to enchant and to move stones, his mother is a muse of narrative, right? Of storytelling and epic poetry, and not one of the other muses that might have been his mother, and that one might have suspected to have been his mother, such as Euterpe, the muse of music, or perhaps Erato, the muse of love poetry, that one could associate with enchantment via that idea, or lyric poetry, which seems to be a closer representation to this idea of musicality, or even polyhymnia, which is another good choice, perhaps the best choice, the muse of hymns and sacred poetry, but in fact that's not the case. And so the way that I've been associating this particular means of narrating these stories with Orpheus also belongs to the mythological background of his origin. All right, then. Now this will be an oversimplification, but I'll state it anyway. So this moment in the larger myth represents this attempt on the part of Orpheus's cousins, the sirens, right, to utilize the expression of song as dance, or one could say probably the inverse, rather, of a kind of dance as lure and exhibitionistic performance, right? This dance as song, and to overcome, right, the prospect of the consequences of the lure and enchantment of this exhibitionistic dance as song. Orpheus enlists his skills of narration as enchantment, right, as the expression of song, and and the virtuosity of song. Now, again, that's an oversimplification, but if one had to assign, semantic values to the series of differences and similarities that are represented in Apollonius's representation of this particular moment in the narrative, and the calling attention, right, to the natal backgrounds, right, of the performers in this particular moment, that cluster, right, of similarities and differences, would have to be engaged, and so in fact, Orpheus is successful, and his music and enchantment and gift and talent overcomes, right, the threat of these beguiling and enchanting sirens, and therefore, he saves the crew. I believe one of the crew members is not spared and perhaps jumps into the water, but perhaps I'm misrepresenting the narrative and misremembering the narrative that may belong to the crew of the Odyssey, in which a different solution, because Orpheus is not a member of that particular crew from a different time, but a different solution is provided by the captain Odysseus, who forces the members of his crew to put wax in their ears so that they won't hear the song, and then he allows himself to hear the song because he wants to experience this beauty, right, and pleasure of the song without being sacrificed to it, and he has the crew members tie himself to a mast, and that's an entirely different solution that gets played out in a different set of contexts. All right then, to return back to the story of Taras and the founding of this particular location, where this terracotta grouping was created, and from where it was stolen. Why is this moment in the narrative of the adventures of the Argonaut pirates and their colonial theft? Why is this particular moment of Orpheus, saving the crew from the enchanting dance song of his cousins, through the power of his enchanting poetry and music? And I would answer that question, or I would suggest that the answer to that question lies in the fact that this is a threat of being shipwrecked and destroyed. This moment represents the threat, right, of destruction that is represented by Orpheus's cousins, and Orpheus here is the savior of his crew and his vessel, or becomes so through the singing of his song, and the story that narrates the colony and the founding of Taras by the eponymous founder Taras. The myth of that history, right, narrates a story in which Taras himself is shipwrecked, and and his life is threatened, and his father Poseidon, comes to his aid and sends dolphins, to retrieve him and to carry him to what will become this colony of Taras, right? So the relationship between Orpheus as the singer, who defeats the threat of this dance song as whirlpool in a sense, the connection between that salvation and the salvation that Taras has provided, via his father on the backs of these dolphins who relocate him to his new home. And then, of course, in the first version, that home would have been the home of his mother, Satyria, right? And so the selection, for this location would make sense on the part of Poseidon, his savior, who is transporting him to his mother's home. And but in a certain way, it also makes sense if we take the other narrative. Why wouldn't Poseidon send his son Taras back home to his mother's home under the rule of Minos? And the answer, there is again, fairly obvious, because this new location is much safer and offers conditions under which his survival and prosperity are much more likely than in his grandfather's home, in which he could quite easily suffer destruction at the hands of this tyrant. And so the figuration, right, of this particular moment, if that's in fact what this terracotta represents, and again, that is not entirely a certainty, but there certainly is evidence within the figuration to support that reading, right? Makes a lot of sense in connection to the mythology of this particular place, and our understanding of these stories in some ways as figura, of one another, if one allows oneself, metaphorical interpretations of the relationships and connections and parallelisms in the various themes and the way they might get played out as abstract stories within larger mythological systems, but also as they relate to topoi and acts of poiesis as expressions, right, of place and identity and ideological belonging, right, in relationship to those places. Okay, so before we jump in time, back to the present or perhaps the future, since the Getty Museum hasn't actually done this yet, the present in which the Getty Museum, promises to return these artifacts to Italy and, for all intents and purposes, Rome, and the future, in which that will actually happen. Before we jump back to the present and future, let's jump to the year 272 BC, which I believe I mistakenly referred to as the year 122 BC, and I believe that I confused the date in which a Roman colony was founded next to Taranto by Rome, and not to the Roman recolonization of the city of Taras, and in any case, whether I mentioned that date, I had remembered it incorrectly, and I had confused those two events. So, correctly stated, the Romans colonized the city of Taras in 221 BC, and the Wikipedia site that refers to this history mentions that they did so in collusion with a number of Greeks who basically, for economic gain, sold their city to these Roman colonizers. So it was by treachery of Greek inhabitants of the city of Tartarus that this was accomplished, and the Romans demolished the defensive walls of the city. And this history mentions that in addition to works of art that were stolen by the Romans and carried off to their capital, Rome itself, 30,000 Greek inhabitants were also sold as slaves and shipped to Rome to function as slaves in the service of the Roman Republic and as slaves of Roman citizens, and the neither the Los Angeles Times article that I was looking at and referring to, nor the National Public Radio article that I was looking at and referring to mention whether this particular terracotta group, Orpheus and the Sirens, was relocated either at that time in the year 2000, in the year 272 BC from its original location, right, the Greek colony of Taras, to the Roman capital, or whether it was left in Taras and later excavated by future pirates who undoubtedly did steal the piece and sold it to eventually sold it to or made its way to the J. Paul Getty Museum, but does mention that it was the property of Italy, and particularly in light, right, of the atrocities of the events which occurred in 272 BC, and these atrocities were committed by Romans upon Greeks. And I want to reiterate that number: 30,000 Greek inhabitants were sold as slaves and carried off to Rome, right, in addition to much art. And again, we're not certain whether this particular piece belonged to that set of art that was carried off to Rome, or whether it remained in Taras and was illegally excavated, many years, in fact, many centuries later, and stolen and eventually, brought to the United States. In any case, I want to suggest that the original crime and theft was made on the part of the Romans, and I think that's pretty clear from the history that we have. And whether this particular piece remained in Taras or was carried off to Rome doesn't much matter, because in conquering the city, right, and in the future history of the colonization of Taras, whether or not the piece was moved, right, from the site of its origin, it was repossessed, right? It was stolen, and its ownership exchanged hands and exchanged cultural hands. And I don't want to suggest that it's wrong for the Getty Museum to return the art which was stolen, but I do perhaps want to suggest that the ways in which time and place and the ownership of place and the expansiveness across time can affect our judgment, concerning what ownership is and what belongs to whom. And my contention would be, and I'll utilize an analogy, to explore, this contention, or to perhaps clarify the ethical dimensions of my argument here, right? During the Holocaust, the Nazis, in addition to the vast amount of lives that they managed to destroy, and the vast amount of physical, emotional, and cultural trauma that they managed to inflict upon a vast number of people, also performed an enormous amount of theft and looting, and in particular stole massive amounts of valuable objects, antiquities, and art from European Jews. Now, if that art, if any particular piece of art stolen by the Nazis and say, somehow displaced or lost or hidden or sheltered or forgotten or abandoned, were discovered by piracy or any other means, and illegally taken from its location in, let's just say it was Germany. It could be anywhere. It could be Poland. It could be Czechoslovakia. It could be Hungary. But let's just say that it was Germany, and it was done without the knowledge of the German state or nation or whoever owned the property, the land, right, upon which this artifact was located. And then it came to the attention of whatever museum that it was. Let's just say that it was the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It came to the attention that this artifact that had originally belonged to a Jewish family from whom it was stolen by the Nazis in the period of the Second World War and the Holocaust, was removed, illegally from Germany. And the Museum of the Modern Art in New York, decided to return it. Would it seem, right or moral or justified in any way, shape, or form to return it to either, the German state or to whoever owned that land upon which this property was I won't really say found, but reappropriated and stolen, once again? And I think the answer is obvious, that it should be returned to its original owner, or the family, or the heritage, from which, that ownership, proceeds, right? That ownership, should be a cultural and familial right of inheritance, an heritage rather than of location and the history of colonial ownership, right, under the law, right? I mean, these issues are really interesting and relevant to the United States, which is a nation founded on entirely, right, on the theft of a continent. And my question is, what it means to unproblematically assume that that the limits of moral obligation and responsibility and justice involve, sending this terracotta piece, back to its original Roman thefts, and that is the colonial history and the piracy and the limit, right, of our narrative of piracy that interests me the most about this piece, and I wonder what it would mean, or suggest in a performance if we were to, follow this project proposal through and have some of these figures discuss being relocated and perhaps discuss the events of those days and perhaps weeks and months in the year 272 BC, in which perhaps, this piece was relocated to Rome, along with the 30,000 Greek inhabitants of Taras, who were relocated and sold as slaves to Roman citizens, and perhaps some of these terracotta figures could remember and have borne witness to the selling of these 30,000 Greek inhabitants of Taras to citizens of Rome. And perhaps in this performance, these terracotta figures could even raise as spirits. And souls a few of these 30,000 inhabitants who were sold as slaves and carried off to Rome, and perhaps more contemporary figures in the art world and the art community could also appear on the stage of this discussion, or perhaps Orpheus could read some of the accounts and intentions of the Getty Museum in returning him, right, and his cousins to Rome, and how comfortable they might feel there, among the other representations of Roman culture in its long and complex history of imperialism